This is such an important topic. This week, on May 1st, was the deadline for many millions of American students to say where they're going to college in the fall. And they were making this important decision that relates not only to where they go to college, but to the direction of their careers and lives. And plenty are wondering, was it the right decision? Was it an informed decision? And the research that you're going to hear about, the discussions very much relate to that. We are thrilled if you want to tweet about today's program, and the hashtag is EduPulse, so hashtag EduPulse. In the foyer, you will see a visual wall of tweets and other information from today's sessions, and we hope you will check that out. We have Greg, a visual note taker, who will be portraying what we talk about today, and so check out his work there. Now, here's the challenge for all of you. We think we have so much we want to cover, and we want to leave time for your schmoozing and questions later. So we're going to just go through this program. It's going to be entertaining, so you'll be fine with it, but it's going to be an initial presentation followed by 2 panel discussions, and then lots of time for you to schmooze and eat. So it's going to be a full morning, though, full of substance and ideas. So now, please join me in welcoming Carol D'Amico, Executive Vice President for Mission Advancement and Philanthropy of Strada Education Network. Welcome, Carol.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you all for coming this morning on finally a beautiful spring day in Washington, D.C. We are really gratified that we had such a great response to this event. We've got a great lineup of speakers, and we think a very intriguing discussion, and that you will enjoy. First, I want to acknowledge all my Strada Education colleagues who are here today. Thank you for your support. We'll try not to embarrass you. And also, we are joined by one of our trustees here today, Dr. Marshall Grigsby. The board has been very supportive of this work and very appreciative for their leadership. And of course, Gallup, our thought partner in this work and hosting us at this fine facility. Always great to be here. And Inside Track is one of our companies, Inside Higher Ed, a great collaboration that we have with them. We're here today to talk about our latest results from the Gallup Strada Consumer Survey. We entered into this collaboration with Gallup about 2 years ago, almost to the month, I think, Brandon. And the purpose was to create the nation's largest database of consumer perceptions of their education experiences and the paths that they took. And we knew that this research would generate groundbreaking insights that would drive action, and action toward making sure that post-high school education is meaningful to every individual who engages, and that they leave that experience equipped to launch their own career and to leave fulfilling career in lives. And we saw how consumer insights, consumer satisfaction research transformed just about every other sector of our economy. Healthcare, finance, hospitality, retail. You can't buy any service or product today without being asked to rate it on a scale of 1 to 5. And not only do you have to rate it, they want you to tell them why you rated it as you did, even if you give them a 5. I didn't get 5 feet from the checkout desk at the hotel this morning when I got an email from Marriott. How did we do, and how can we do better? And so the power of consumer insights to transform in every other sector is what really motivated us to think about how to apply this to higher education. And when you think about it, it's rather astonishing that no one has done this yet to date before us. Let me just talk a little bit about Strada Education Network for those of you who may not be familiar with us. For the past 5 years now, with the arrival of our CEO, Bill Hansen, we have been focused, our nonprofit organization, headquartered in Indianapolis, Indiana, has been focused on our mission of completion with a purpose, connecting education and employment. And we've been driven by some undeniable disconnects between education and employment. The underemployed college graduate was something early on that came to our attention. And in fact, we are going to have a new report on underemployment of college graduates coming out under our Institute for the Future of Work very soon. And so look for that. But the issue is real, and it is consequential. We are also driven by the number of unfilled jobs that require post-high school credentials, yet we're going unfilled because the talent was not available. And then, of course, Gallup's own survey of the perceptions of employers. When only about a third of employers either agree or strongly agree that higher education is producing quality talent, then I think there is an indication of a disconnect. Our consumer research at Strada, our philanthropy, our newly formed Institute for the Future of Work, which was announced last week, and all of our affiliate organizations that make up our network, CALE, MZ, Inside Track, Road Trip Nation, College Confidential, Dextera Institute, and the Institute for Education and the Future of Work, we're all aligned in the network to generate solutions around these disconnects and to advance our mission of completion with a purpose. Since we started the Strada-Gallup Consumer Survey in 2016, we have talked literally with over 250,000 adults in the US about their education experiences. That's about 10,000 a month. And as you can imagine, we are learning a lot. And thanks to you all and your colleagues and other leaders in higher education, we are elevating the consumer voice in the national discussion we are having about the transformation of higher education. Today marks an anniversary of sorts. About a year ago, this time, we issued our first report from the survey at the National Press Club. And that report was titled, On Second Thought, U.S. Adults Reflect on Their Education Decisions. And in that report, it was revealed that over half of the adults in the U.S. who participated in higher education and completed higher education wish they could do it all over again if they had the opportunity. So this marks this first report since we've issued about 5 major reports. And we've had, over the past year, a very gratifying response. And frankly, when we entered this, we didn't know what the response would be to this new notion of consumer satisfaction and how higher ed would perceive it, how it would be perceived in the philanthropic community and the policy community. And it's been very well received. But even the word consumers has gotten a lot of attention, because in higher education, we had not thought about students as consumers before. And so we've had that discussion with the community. But actually, students indeed are consumers. They make massive investments of their time and their money to go to a particular institution of higher education, and they are purchasing specific services, and they have specific needs that they want to get out of that experience. And so one of our reports, we talk to the consumers about what those needs are and why they engaged in higher education to begin with. And to some, of course, this is going to be obvious, but I think we need to continue to say it. First and foremost, people engage in post-high school education for a career or an employment outcome. There is not even a close second reason. And when you ask college freshmen, 85% of them say they go to college to get a good job. Now, unfortunately, though, many consumers don't realize those ambitions as a result of their participation. We did learn through our study that we published last month with Gallup, the current student survey, the Strada-Gallup current student survey. And we surveyed students, existing students in bachelor degree granting colleges about how well they thought they were being prepared for their careers. And not enough were, and I think Brandon will talk about this, but what was interesting is their confidence in how well they were being prepared actually decreased each year that they were in school. The biggest single insight that has emerged through our 5 major reports is this: the closer consumers' education experience is tied to work experience, the more successful and valuable they think that their experience was for them. And as we will hear today, the more relevant people find their courses to their work and their day-to-day lives, the greater their belief that their experience in higher education was of high quality and worth the cost. In fact, this issue of relevance is a better predictor of whether an experience in higher education is considered of quality and value than the traditional measures we have used in higher ed to connote quality, things like SAT and ACT scores, graduation rates, and alumni, even among alumni earnings. But the good news in all of this is that we have learned a lot about how to provide that kind of relevance. To start with, on our second report, we learned that people get the most valuable advice about what career to explore and to pursue from employers and from people who work in a field that they're interested in, more so than traditional guidance resources, such as resources on the website or the counselors in high school or in college. We also know what makes a difference in higher ed to create relevance. We know that when you incorporate work-based experiences into the curriculum and real-world projects, that makes a difference in how consumers view their preparation. We also know that when you equip faculty to do very simple things to connect what they're teaching in the classroom to how useful that might be in a future career, that makes a difference. We know that an internship or a job that is related to your field of study that you are pursuing at the college, that makes a difference. And we know that when the curriculum has been developed with and through employers, that makes a difference in terms of how consumers view their experience. Now, these strategies are not necessarily costly ones to do. It does take the will to do it, and it does take, in some cases, transforming the current model of how we deliver post-high school education. Over the next few months, we're going to have additional reports. We are working with the Lumina Foundation on a series of reports that are dedicated to understanding the 90 million adults in the US who do not have a post-high school credential. So look for those over the next year. We are also planning a state-by-state analysis of some of the insights from the consumer survey. And we plan to issue that in early 2019. We at Strada believe that state policymakers are very well positioned to act on many of these insights along with higher education leaders in their states. In fact, our first state-by-state report is going to be issued in late June, and it's going to be on the issue of America's appetite for additional education to advance their career and lives. And I think that some of the findings by state is going to be very interesting and very illuminating, especially to state policymakers as they try to figure out how to engage that population in the upskilling efforts. The good news from all of these insights is that solutions are emerging. And the good news for us at Strada is the hunger there is for these kinds of solutions. I'd say, for me, if there's one thing I have learned over the last year or so that we have been at this, is that people want solutions. The insights are well received, but we've got to do more than just admire the research and celebrate the research. We have to work together to develop the strategies to address the insights that we are gaining. Today is a very important step forward in that. We have assembled a group of experts to react to this report that we have issued here today. These are thought leaders from higher education, government, and employment. And we selected each one of these participants very carefully and purposefully because it's going to take all of those stakeholders to really move the needle on the issue we're talking about today, that only 26% of Americans thought they had a relevant higher education experience for their careers and their day-to-day lives. In many ways, you here today are one big focus group for us. And we hope the start of a conversation about this issue, as our next report on the issue of relevance is going to be on what do people think the strategies are to address it. So again, thank you so much for being here today. This is a very important discussion for us to learn from you and to hear your input and to get your guidance as we continue to develop the important voice of the consumer in higher education. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our partner, Brandon Bastide, Executive Director of Education and Workforce Development at Gallup, and he is going to present the actual findings from our latest report, From Life to College, Relevance and the Value of Higher Education. Brandon?
Thank you, Carol, and a huge thanks to all of our incredible colleagues that we've been in the trenches with from Strada Education Network. I see the Gallup team all in one row back there as well. And so thank you to my incredible colleagues at Gallup who have made this work come to life. You know, the first thing I want to pause on for a minute is a huge thanks to the 250,000 Americans who took the time to be interviewed by our interviewing team to answer these questions. Think about that, 250,000 U.S. adults. We should all be grateful to them for their contribution here. As Carol mentioned, it's quite remarkable that in this day and age, no project like this has ever existed. Several hundred-year history of higher education in the United States. And no one, until Strada and Gallup got together, had made an effort to do a large-scale research project asking these individuals about their experiences. Our hope, of course, is that this is a beginning of what Carol described as not just research and findings, but real action, because what we're realizing, as much as we're learning from these consumers, where you could sit and admire parts of the problem, they're also giving us very detailed insights about how we can improve at all levels. Individual students, professors, institutions of higher education, and policymakers, to name just a few, but also employers, which need to become a bigger part of our conversation. The mission of this work is as high as anything that we're involved with at Gallup. Some of you know one of the famous expressions that Dr. George Gallup said. He said that if democracy is supposed to be based on the will of the people, then someone ought to find out what that will is. And as I think about the mission that Strada has had in this big, bold vision of creating this database of consumer insights and Gallup's role in helping that happen, I would offer a little twist to George's famous quote and say that if higher education is about the success of students, then someone ought to figure out all their pathways to that success. So with that, let me dive into a little bit of a preamble of some of the research that has led up to this, because I think it provides powerful context to the core findings that are in this report. And so first of all, Carol touched on some of these things. This is one very large project that's linked to a number of things that Gallup and Strada have partnered on, which includes now a large representative study of currently enrolled students, the ongoing work that we kicked off with Purdue and the Gallup Purdue Index studying the outcomes of college graduates, and also some forthcoming data of interviews of employers. So we're trying to get at these insights from all of these different critical key constituents. But we have to start with getting the premise right, and Carol touched on this. There are indeed many reasons why people value higher education, but by far the number one reason why we value it, and it doesn't matter who we interview, general population, college freshmen as UCLA does through the SERP survey, business leaders, parents of 5th through 12th graders, the number one reason why we value higher education is to get a good job. As leaders, we have to start there in getting the premise right. Because although graduation from college is certainly linked to higher earnings and job placement in very powerful ways, we know that it's also a failure from the consumer's viewpoint to graduate but not get that good job that they set out to do. Those are the things that we're trying to prevent from happening. And as you look at some of the disconnects here, how much of this is reality versus perception, it's hard to disentangle, but there are very big disconnects in how well we're doing on this. If we interview provosts of college universities, as we do with our partners at Inside Higher Education for their annual survey of provosts, provosts feel pretty good about how well they're doing in preparing students for the workplace. But when you interview the general population or C-level business executives, for example, asking similar but slightly different questions here, the scores are very different. And so obviously there's a lot of work we need to do, whether this is a communications and perception or messaging issue, or it's also linked to real challenges, right? Like the skills gap conversation that we're having in the United States. We just hit an all-time high, some of you might have missed this, of open jobs in the United States. Right now today, there are 6.5 million open jobs in the United States. And so that is a conversation that we're trying to get deeply engaged with to understand why are there these disconnects and what can we do to bridge the gap here of this incredible gap of 90% to 11% on one end of the scale. Here's what's interesting. One of the surveys we just did for the Association of Governing Boards of College Trustees, Of all the groups we've surveyed in the last couple of years about their perceptions of higher education, trustees are the most skeptical of any population. Think about that for a minute. These are the individuals who have the fiduciary obligation of our institutions of higher education. When you ask them questions about how they think we're doing in preparing graduates for success in the global marketplace, or in their understanding that colleges and universities know what employers are looking for in job candidates, it's 6% and 7% respectively that strongly agree we're doing a good job on those markers. Now, this won't surprise you. They think their own institutions are doing a slightly better job than institutions nationally, but even their ratings of their own institutions are astonishingly low in the grand scheme of things. And so if you see the disconnects even among trustees at this trustee leadership level, you know that there's something that we need to do to fix the problem. Going back to these college freshmen, right? 85% of freshmen say the top reason why they go to college is to get a good job. On the back end of this, you look at recent graduates, and it turns out that of graduates in the last 10 years, 27% say they had a good job waiting for them upon graduation. And about a third of them who are seeking employment after graduation took 7 months or longer to land that good job. Now, the interesting thing is I don't know how I feel about that data because we've never really had a historical marker on that kind of question because we haven't asked these kinds of questions. The best that most colleges and universities have done is a 6-month destination survey where they ask this question: do you have a job? Yes or no? Now think of all the different ways that somebody could say yes to that and it be ultimately a failure or a disappointment relative to their expectations. Was that a job that required a college degree? Was it a job that you think was a good job, right? These are obviously subjective measures, but who better to judge those answers than that person, him or herself? Interestingly enough, we know that your motivations for attending college are linked to the likelihood of completion. So those who had motivations linked to work or job outcomes are more likely to be graduates than those who had other motivations, like I'm going to learn or to become a well-rounded citizen or whatever it might be. Now, here's an important point. There are many reasons why we value higher education, but those who were motivated by work-related reasons are more likely to be completers. And as Carol mentioned, when we asked people about their advice for college, we asked about all kinds of different sources. It turns out that the highest rated advice is currently the least utilized. So Americans give their highest ratings to their advice from work-based sources, right? People who are in jobs, experts in their field, and yet as a percentage, it's the least utilized resource. This is, of course, a huge opportunity for employers to play a role, for all of us as professionals to play a role, because the traditional counseling and advising system, in simple terms, needs our help. Some of you have seen the data, right? The average number of students to high school guidance counselors. I mean, I think the national average is 500 to 1. In some states, it's 1,500 to 1. We all need to help. There's a role that we can all play in this. It is not simply about pointing the fingers at higher education institutions. So now let me transition to the findings specifically in this report. As Carol mentioned, we've interviewed 250,000 Americans. This is data based on a little over 110,000 who have had some college experience. So these are folks who had some college all the way through postgraduate. So it includes those who started college when are non-completers, and then at all levels, associate degree, bachelor's degree, postgraduate. And we're really keying off of two really powerful questions that we asked in the survey, what we have called relevance as a descriptor. And what we mean by relevance in this report is the degree to which these graduates or non-graduates said that their courses that they took were directly applicable to the work that they do. And another dimension of this, whether they felt what they learned was applicable to their day-to-day lives. And so, as Carol mentioned, at a very high level, if we put this on a scale, right, these were 5-point scales, and we are going to break it down and show you the percent who said 5 to both, all the way down to 1 to both. But if you say, okay, how many of us nailed it on relevance? You say, strongly agree. The courses I took are relevant to the work I'm doing, and what I learned is relevant to my day-to-day life. It's a quarter. 1/4. Now again, it's hard to judge whether that's low or high because relatively speaking, we've never measured this kind of data before. But obviously when you say a quarter, the first thing I think about is we could certainly do better. And so let's talk about why relevance is so relevant. Because it turns out that it is the strongest predictor of whether people say their education was worth the cost and a high quality education of anything that we have been able to compare it to. You look at those who give it a 10 compared to ones on both sides of the scale. So these are combining, right? So I said 5 strongly agree to both questions versus 1 to both questions. So this is the 2 through 10 scale that we're using here. Look at the differences in their feelings that their education was worth the cost and high quality. It's between 3 and 5x differential based on your feelings of relevance. And as you relate relevance to traditional objective indicators of quality, which, by the way, do account for some of the variance of whether people feel like their education was worth the cost or that it was high quality, factors like the graduation rates of these institutions, the student loan default rates, average alumni earnings, the average test scores of students coming in, right? These are all factors that we use as objective measures of quality, and they matter, but in comparison to relevance, relevance beats all of those by 2 to 3x in terms of its power in predicting the variance that you had a high quality education that was worth the cost. Interestingly, we also know that relevance is related to your overall well-being, how you rate and experience your life. And again, we show you the same scale here of those who nailed it on the relevance scale compared to those who didn't, and their life evaluation. So this is not just a metric that relates to their work performance and work outcomes. It's about how they are experiencing and living their lives. The study we did of currently enrolled college students, you even see the linkage of relevance in the real-time experience of students. This is a report that we put out about a month and a half ago, and if you haven't caught it, I would highly recommend that you dive into it. But it turns out that the top driver of well-being for currently enrolled college students are career-related relevance questions. Things like the degree to which they say the knowledge and skills they're learning is going to be applicable in the workplace, and that their faculty and staff at the college or university they attend is committed to helping students find a rewarding career. And even if they say they had one single conversation with a staff or faculty member about their careers, that alone moves the needle dramatically in their feelings of their current well-being and the degree to which they feel prepared for the workplace as they graduate. Now, we know that there are varying degrees of relevance, and so I want to unpack this a bit for you. The first point is, and this is not going to be surprising, completion really matters. So those who started college but did not complete the some college no degree category, you can see a very low percentage, only 14%, hit the high marks on relevance. Now see, we think about college non-completion in a lot of ways. We think about the obvious life hurdles that come in front of people, right? Finances and, a death in the family, a parent loses a job, you got married, right? There's all kinds of things that go into that. One of the things we haven't talked much about is just maybe they had a lousy student experience. Maybe they started and didn't see the relevance. And when you talk about something as daunting as completing a degree, you need to have some pretty powerful motivation. I would argue you need to see the relevance in what you're doing. So to what degree is the college completion issue in the United States also something that is linked to, dare I say it, a poor consumer experience? Now you could say student experience if you don't like the word consumer. I'm cool with that too. But I want to provoke us to think about this in a slightly different mindset. What's interesting, as you'll see, is that the 4-year degree holders are actually pretty low on this scale compared to the 2-year degree and the postgraduate degree in terms of relevance. So now when you get underneath the surface of that, it becomes pretty interesting because you can see the highest percentage of relevance actually come from folks who are in the vocational technical certificate group. They're essentially a statistical tie with those who get a postgraduate degree, and you can see a 2-year degree is slightly higher than a 4-year degree. But here's one of the interesting observations we've had about this. What's in common between a technical trade-related certificate and postgraduate work? In many cases, it's the alignment between what's being taught there and a very specific work outcome. By postgraduate study, you are gearing, whether it's an MBA, a law degree, right? You are gearing more specifically to a workplace outcome, just as you are on this other angle of a technical vocational piece. And so, as you'll see, this isn't necessarily what we teach in terms of the content, it's also the context in which we teach it. It's totally possible, for example, to make a liberal arts degree incredibly relevant to the workplace. But we need to think about how that happens, because it doesn't happen in a naturally occurring fashion, as I'll show you in a couple different slides here. There are varying degrees of relevance by the type of field or degree that you also had. And so again, here we break down 2-year degree for and postgraduate work by those who majored in business as a rolled up category, in liberal arts, in public service, and STEM. And you can see that STEM 2-year degrees are off the charts relative to others in their relevance drivers. What's also interesting, though, is if you look at the 4-year degree holders, the tops there are folks who studied public administration type degrees. It actually beats STEM majors at the bachelor degree level. And then, of course, if you look at postgraduate, you see the STEM-related postgraduate degrees are overall the highest in terms of relevance. And when you break this down further, and I apologize, in the report you can see little lead lines here. They don't show up very clearly, but I think you can follow the chart. Here's what's interesting. You see liberal arts 2-year and 4-year degrees are pretty low on this relevance scale relative to the others. But look at liberal arts postgraduate degrees. They're among the best. And it's just an interesting observation, obviously something we want to dig more into. But when you think about it, you go, okay, well, this isn't just liberal arts, because a postgraduate degree in liberal arts, according to this data, has an incredible amount of relevance. You look at, it's not just a 4-year degree or a postgraduate degree, because you see off-the-chart scores for 2-year STEM degrees. So it certainly starts to open our minds to the idea that there are indeed many different pathways to success, that we need to help people become smarter about all these different pathways to success, and to think about, I mean, in simple terms, what is it that makes a postgraduate degree in the liberal arts much more relevant than a liberal arts degree at the 2-year and 4-year level? I don't think it's the content. I think it's the context. And the context was very well referenced by Carol's points about making sure that there's some sort of work-related experience. So I'll give you one from our Gallup Purdue Index data. Liberal arts majors are less likely than STEM majors to say they had an internship or they applied what they were learning in the classroom. Not a big surprise. However, the liberal arts majors who had an internship where they applied what they were learning have equivalent outcomes to the STEM graduates on earnings and every other thing that we've dissected in work outcomes. So see, this is a much more nuanced story that gives us, I think, very actionable insights on how we can, yes, indeed, capture an applied work experience for people who major in philosophy. This is totally doable. I can do it as a student. A professor can help make those connections, and I can create a program that makes that something that somebody just can't miss the mark on. So with that, I want to say a huge thank you to our partners at Strada. This is possible because of a very big, bold, inspiring vision that they had. Gallup is happy to be helping them execute on that big, bold, inspiring vision. And I think what you're going to learn today from this data and the data that comes forward is that this is likely going to become one of the most clarifying, actionable, and transformative initiatives in the history of higher education. So with that, I'll turn things back over to Scott, who will introduce our panels. Thank you all for being here today.
So thank you for that great overview of the research findings, and Carol, for your thoughts as well. We have now to discuss them. On my far left, we have Dave Clayton, who is Senior Vice President for Consumer Insights of the Strada Education Network. Then we have Millie Garcia. She is president of the American Association of State Colleges and Universities. And before that, she had a career working in the Cal State and other systems, but in the Cal State system, leading large universities that have a particularly strong track record at serving first-generation students. And then to my immediate left, we have Michael Sorrell, who's president of Paul Quinn College, which if you haven't heard of it, you're one of the few people who have escaped his branding efforts, but is a historically black institution in Texas, is a work college, which we'll talk about, and again, a really important player in helping students who don't come to the college with a lot of advantages. And I want to start with Millie and Michael as people who are currently involved in higher education. Based on what we've just heard about the low percentage who see relevance in their college experience and the challenges that graduates face in finding a job and a career, do you think these are fair? Do they worry you as college leaders? Millie, I'll start with you.
You know, as I represent over 400 institutions of state colleges and universities in the country, we understand this issue very well. And I want to thank Strada and Gallup for doing this, because our students, quite frankly, do come in for a job. We are the ones that have 120 minority serving institutions under our ASCU brand. We serve first generation low income. We understand that they are coming in to look for that job, and it is our role to make sure that they fall in love with education and go into lifelong learning, because we are preparing them for jobs we don't even know exist today. So yes, we talk about jobs from the very beginning, and what we need to do is be more intentional about how we do that, starting from the very beginning, starting from the first year when they walk in on that campus, and have them connect with the pathway and make sure it is about graduation with completion. And I agree with Carol and what she's talking about. I can give you many examples if you'd like, since we are the ones that represent 89% of the students that graduate with bachelor's degrees in this country. So I can give you examples if we're ready for that.
Why don't you give an example?
Well, let me give you our California State University example, since it's the organization I just left, California State University, Fullerton. We began looking at the first year experience. We began reimagining what is it that our students need, because they come from very different minority backgrounds or low income. What is it that they're looking for? And have our students go through that first year experience. But more importantly, we also put in each college. Cal State Fullerton is over 40,000 students with 8 colleges. So imagine it's huge. But when we brought it down to the colleges with the associate dean, the assistant dean of student affairs, career advisors, intentional advising on careers, using our employers and advisory committees, we brought up graduation over 30% in 5 years. And that is because we are intentionally focused on not only their academics, but what they're doing with what we call high impact practices, internships, working in the field, or working in labs. I will tell Brandon that our political science majors do the DC Scholars Program. And so they are in DC working on Capitol Hill, or they're working with our legislators. We are making sure that they see the connection of what they are learning to their position. And ASCU institutions are doing that in our conferences, where we bring together 44 institutions funded by Gates, and Carol's a thought partner with us as we look at careers, on how do we begin from the very beginning for them to see the connections. Coming from a private, my first institution, a private, we knew this well. We knew exactly how to track students and understand that they have to have 2 internships and a bachelor's degree before they graduate, and then we help them get that career.
So Michael, how do you view this issue?
So first I want to say how always happy I am to be able to hang out with my friend Millie and the important work that Carol and Brandon are doing. But to me, all of this comes down to what happens when you lead without humility, right? Higher education has built a system that has behaved without humility. If you lead with humility, you understand that perhaps you should actually ask your students how things are going, right? That you allow for the possibility that you could be wrong, right? So I think about my own personal experiences and things that made a difference. To me, I had an amazing professor at Oberlin College. I was a government major, so one of those majors that theoretically should be useless, right? But was incredibly useful because I had a professor that really made things relevant, right? And taught us to ask questions, very simple questions, as we aspired for leadership. He said, always ask, what if I'm wrong? So at Paul Quinn College, we ask that question every single semester. What if we're wrong? Are we doing the best that we can do for our students? And that means that the educational experience has to be an iterative process. So you have to allow for the fact that sometimes the direction that you think you're going isn't the right direction for the day. And then you have to change. And it can't take you 5 years and 5,000 committee meetings to change. You have to change with more suddenness, with a greater sense of urgency. So I'm not surprised by this because we talked to our students, and here are the things they told us several years ago. One, they just couldn't afford it. Now, we were only charging $24,000 a year at that point, but I don't know how you exist in a world where semester after semester, you are looking at the data from your institution and you are having to behave as a bill collector, right? That is an unpleasant experience. It is especially unpleasant if you actually know your students. See, I teach classes, so I don't need anyone to interpret my students' experience because they tell me every class, right? And so the students said we couldn't afford it. Then talked to employers, and we talked to the students, and neither one were happy with the academic experiences and preparation that our students were receiving. Now, we're not the only institution that that was the case. We just happened to be the one that was the most honest about it, right? So we talked about it and said, we can do something different and better here. So one, we discovered a system that would allow us to address the deficiencies that we identified. That was becoming a work college. Now, we couldn't become a traditional work college because we didn't have the resources and we weren't in a rural location. So we had to find a different way. So we made up our own version of higher education. We created the urban work college model. And our students work off campus in corporate jobs in addition to working on campus in some of the campus jobs. It allowed us to cut tuition and fees by $10,000 and to create a pathway for students to graduate with less than $10,000 of debt if they so choose. Now, all of this was fine, but then we kept asking questions. And we discovered that we needed to change the pedagogical model and the academic experience. So now we've created something called reality-based education. And that comes from simply asking people, what do you need? What works? Here's what they needed and here's what worked. First of all, students need to be immersed in team-based project learning, all right? Now this is data that literally, if anyone had focused truly on what you guys produced, it's all right there, right? I mean, we just dealt with a different demographic, which are 85% of our students are Pell Grant, but they came to the same place. They needed to know how to work in teams. They needed to be able to write. They needed to be able to speak properly. They need to be able to conduct in critical thinking, and they needed to develop digital mastery, right? So we built a curriculum around that. So now we have reading across a curriculum, speaking across a curriculum, critical thinking across a curriculum, building digital mastery across a curriculum, experiential learning, and project-based learning. But all that came because we dared ask the question, what if we're wrong, and how can we do better?
So I've got some follow-up questions for both of you, but first, Dave, I wanted to give you a shot. How do you think higher ed is doing at responding to the issues that Strada is raising?
Well, the consumers are raising the issues. I mean, we're asking and trying to be humble about it and thoughtful and have the insights. And so that 250,000 and the 110,000 that we're talking about today who are employed, they've been successful in a life outcome of employment. They've aspired to that, sought it, and fulfilled that. Think of those who are not even at that level. And then they've had the opportunity and the resources to engage in college, at least, many of them completing. It's 25% of them engaging and not completing, 75% 2-year, 4-year. So you think about who's there. And in terms of how higher ed is responding, 26% of the people are finding it. It's there. It may be an individual professor, it may be an individual student, it may be institutions. We can look at an institution level and see the average ratings of relevance by the students who attended and experienced that, and we do see variation. We can tell you who's 8 and who's 64 and who's 220. And so that ability to look at institutions and understand and provide insight. Overall though, part of a decade and a half of my career has been spent doing social impact marketing and branding. So for Got Milk, for the Nature Conservancy, for the American Heart Association, for the Hewlett Foundation, right, branding. And
That was all you?
I was a part of a good team with lots of good
Fantastic
people,
stuff.
but have worked at those kind of levels. And what they're looking for is, how do we become relevant to the individuals that we seek to serve and influence? And so if you just took relevance and said, here's a brand promise, and only 26% of our consumers and 26% of our human capital, higher ed doesn't exist without the students. If you said this is the promise, and then you were explicit about, we are giving you team-based projects because when you go to the workplace, the thing that employers are looking for, and we'll see in our survey this summer, and LinkedIn was talking about this morning in the news, leadership skills, critical analysis skills. So your team-based learning is not just because I don't want to grade and I want to throw you all into a mix. I want you to look at those skills and learn those, and so being explicit. So you can think about lots of ways in which you can frame the experiences that are already happening, give them relevance as it's going along, and communicate that so that down the road your satisfied customers are understanding where it came from and why it's valuable, and know where to go look for more.
Right.
So I want to dive into this relevance question because that's key to what we're talking about, and all of your comments really relate to this. Some faculty members, when they hear relevance, assume that every course has to be explicitly career preparation, how to become a fill in the blank. And so if you look at the three of you, very successful people, you probably didn't as undergrads take courses on how to be a college president, how to lead a nonprofit. But you were, in fact, having lots of important experiences. And I think, Michael, you talked about writing, teamwork, communication skills. How do you, does relevance run counter to what people tend to talk about? General education skills, soft skills is really what we've been talking about. And so many employers say they worry about a lack of soft skills. How do you make soft skills relevant or shift the perception of them? Millie?
So I will begin by saying, when you start to bring in the employers to have conversations as advisory committees on campuses, to talk about what is it that they are looking for. Yes, they are looking for the skills and content, but they are looking for people that can work. We're not talking about diversity. In a diverse world that is America, and how do you engage in that teamwork? How do you plan? How do you execute? So when you bring in these employers, and then you bring them before the students, that in California, what we're trying to do at the California state system is they bring in employers to actually give a project where they're engaged in watching the students do the work. So there's one very important philanthropist in California that actually set up a room like Wall Street, gave the students dollars, and then watched them plan and execute shares, and how they studied it, how they recommended it, and spoke as if they were talking to shareholders. When they see that and see that they're you say, this is what we need from you. Not only the actual academic skills, but the soft skills that are needed. It's both and not either or. And faculty start to see that when they start to work with the actual stakeholders in the community and the people that are employing our students.
Oh, Millie, I just had a moment. The exercise that you described was one that was in a class I took called Public Policy. That class changed my life.
Absolutely.
That exercise changed my life, right? And I think what's interesting about all of this, candidly, is we don't listen enough to the marketplace. We don't listen enough to parents, and we don't listen enough to students. So the only people, or disproportionately, the influencers of the higher ed experience are the people who hire no one and don't provide any consumers, I mean, think about that for a moment, right? So we have to listen to the employers because that's what we're there for. We're there to educate individuals for these amazing lives. And the pathway to those amazing lives, and the data is very clear about this, is your ability to thrive.
Exactly.
All right? And your ability to thrive is tied to your ability to earn. And even your ability to think has to translate into something that can economically move the needle. Now, parents are entrusting you with their children, and increasingly adults are coming to school trusting you with their hopes, their aspirations, and their dreams. And I would argue that when we start talking about shared governance, I want to talk about shared learning, right? And I think what we have to understand is we are now in the age, and we should have been there long ago, where this was about shared learning, and that there is a pathway, there is a system, there's literally a triangle to learning, right? There are the students, their parents, the employers, and in the middle, the institution. And the institution serves as the root that allows the other three corners, or the three corners to thrive. And we have to take ownership of that, we have to understand that, and then we have to respond to that. And responding to that means that higher education really needs to rethink the faculty-driven model. It doesn't mean they aren't important, absolutely they are, but it means that it is time now for them to share the stage.
I agree with Michael, and I will add something else to that. We need to make sure that our faculty know the students we are serving. The students in California are not the same, the students in the middle of the country are not the same in the Northeast. What communities they come from? What are their families like? Are they first generation? What are their aspirations and dreams? We need to be going into the communities with our faculty and ensure that we understand the changing America and that learning is done in multiple ways, and that we have to adjust to the new learning as we look at who is it that we're educating today, so that we can then connect the relevance for those families and those communities and those students.
What Millie is talking about is something in the HBCU community we know who they are and we know whose they are, right? And when you do that, I think about the difference it's made. I have gone into the high schools and the communities that our students come from. So I've talked to their parents, I've talked to their principal, I've talked to the people who own the corner stores that they buy groceries from. You get a different understanding of your students. The other thing we need to understand is increasingly the majority of students who are coming to us are going to be coming from poverty.
Absolutely.
Pell Grant students are already the majority of students in college right now. That was before the public educational system was majority students who are on free and reduced lunches.
So I want to follow up on this issue of who the students are. There's new data out today from NCES in which they looked at the life results of those who had the misfortune to graduate from college in 2008, just as the Great Recession was hitting, and they compared those who graduated with debt and those who didn't have debt. And those who graduated with debt in 2008 tended to report that by 2012 they had delayed buying a home, they had delayed marriage, and by nearly 2 to 1, those with debt had taken a job they didn't want because they had to, compared to those who didn't have debt. And so as you think about relevance for a person who doesn't just want a job, but who needs a job, who can't go home and live with mom and dad and just wait it out, how does that change the obligation of colleges?
For me, it's critical. It's one of the things that I was talking about as I left California, and we are going to be talking about it at ASCU. What is the responsibility of the institution once they graduate to help them find their next step? May that be their career that they're looking for, or may that be they're going to graduate school. We also need them to go to graduate school. And so what is our responsibility? How does that college with the student success team not only help that student get through graduation, but how do they help them, A, have those internships, B, prepare them to go into those interviews, and then help them get that first career step in their lives? This is not new, this is not rocket science, Private institutions, there are some private institutions that have been doing this for years. But what we have to do at public state colleges and universities, especially because we're serving those that need that job, we need to now focus and be intentional to the step and take responsibility. If we say you're helping me with a career, then help me get that first career with your guidance and your help. I think that's where we have to go.
Dave?
Yeah, I just offer that we also need to think about the opportunity cost of those who may not have debt but are farther along in their lives. So 43% of individuals in their 40s report that they feel a need for additional education to advance in their careers. So what is the cost for them of coming back with family, life, work circumstances, of coming back in? I think one of the most interesting things in these reports is that last slide that Brandon showed, and you look at that relevant investment and value. This is data that will come later this summer, but 65% of those with a vocational technical professional education certificate say strongly agree it was worth the cost. 62% of those with postgraduate strongly agree it was worth the cost. So in terms of that value of coming back, being very focused, knowing what you want, knowing you can get somewhere with it, even if you're at a different stage of life, is critically important, is illustrating the power and importance of relevance across that lifespan of a student experience.
So this speaks to something that we currently have in development, and it's a concept, our working title is College for Life, right? And it's this idea that you are never done, okay? That at any point of your educational or your life engagement, you can come back and have your skills retooled and freshened up. And candidly, that idea came to us because we're currently obsessed with this whole idea of artificial intelligence. Mm-hmm. And there's a report out there that says that something like 40 million Americans will be displaced in the next 5 to 7 years as a result of artificial intelligence. Now, those 40 million Americans probably aren't us. Those are 40 million Americans that have somehow managed to claw their way out of poverty, but they are barely out of poverty. And the idea that they're going to be displaced when they are already barely hanging on is terrifying, because there are already 45 million Americans who live in poverty. So if you slide another 40,000 people who have been marginalized or live marginalized lives into the poverty category, and we are now a country of 90 million individuals that are living in poverty, or I know it's 85 million, but let's just assume we're scaling up, right? 90 million Americans that are going to be living in poverty, then we as educational institutions cannot consider ourselves to have the luxury of not addressing that issue. And the only way to address it is to treat our institutions as centers of lifelong learning. So I think we're going to have to tackle that issue.
And just a note, I think in additional Gallup research, 49% of those who say if you were to lose your job to artificial intelligence, where would you look for that education? 49% say to my employer.
Right.
Right, and so 37% online or in person back to higher education. So that notion of how are we relevant and how are we seen, and how do people have the confidence and trust they'll get the value they seek if they're going to invest their lives.
And let me just say, the interesting part about, mine's short, right? The interesting part about this is those are people who have employers who could provide that.
Right.
If your employer is McDonald's, and you're on you've cobbled together an existence between 3 jobs and you're working part-time, which employer is going to make that personal investment in you?
And I think we also need to go back to the students who came from that poverty, who have made it. What was it that we did for them? Let's zero in on them. Yeah. The Chetty study from Stanford says that ASCU institutions have moved students from the lowest socioeconomic status to the highest. Who are those students? Let's dig into that. Let's find out why they were able to climb up. And the other thing I will say about lifelong learning, our institutions have to take what they have a continuing ed center from, it's off campus somewhere usually, bring it to the center, have them working with the colleges and saying lifelong learning is forever, and here is a place that if whatever career you're in, you can come back here to working with employers and working with communities in order to prepare you. But right now we have that center all the way somewhere else, It's a sidebar rather than being in the center and helping those we have admitted to move forward.
So I want to ask you about employers and also elite institutions. I had a visit from a liberal arts college president a few months ago who told me about this wonderful new effort they were doing, where they were getting all of their alumni who work for Fortune 500 companies to create internships just for their students. Ooh. And so I asked him, so basically you're bolstering the old boy network.
What else is new?
And he was very proud of it, and because they wanted to do that. And I guess you hear a lot of employers will line up to endorse the work of Strada and Gallup, but a lot of them will create internships for students at elite institutions, even as your institutions do the things you're talking about. And a lot of them will still do things like have unpaid internships, which effectively means internships for rich kids. And so I'm just wondering, as you look at the universe, and particularly elite institutions and elite employers, do they really put their money where their mouth is on these issues?
You know, it is for us. It's how do you go back to those successful alums that have made it, who understand that their career is based from where they started. So we have an alum who is the president of US Bank, who said his whole career is dedicated to his graduation at Cal State Fullerton. We have another person that graduated who went back to his own business, multimillionaire, asked how many people had graduated from the CSU, and he realized how many of his people had graduated from the CSU and started hiring them. So it is about us being connected to our alumni, the successful ones, being connected to businesses, proving our students' worth, and making sure our students go in totally prepared to take on those roles. And in some cases, some of those employers are saying they're doing better than the elite institutions because they don't feel entitled. They are there to do their work.
Yeah, listen. And I just, first of all, I have to own this. I am a product of the elite institutions, right? I am who my parents' success educated me to become, right? I took full advantage of those opportunities. Now, that being said, we have to stop looking to them to lead a revolution, right? Revolutions don't start from above. They never have. In the history of man, revolutions never began with the landed gentry, the people whose life was already wonderful for, saying, you know what? We are unhappy and we're going to make a change. That doesn't happen, right? That's never happened. It comes from people who are living with the realities of day-to-day life that isn't good enough. So I'm not going to ask those institutions to show me the light out of the darkness, right? They're the reason it's dark already, okay? So what we have to do is understand that if we really want to change this, it is on all of us who are managing in places where every decision matters, right? We fly without a net. Mm-hmm. Our students fly without nets. So if we make a mistake, there is a real world consequence to that failure. And that real world consequence is that students who are already on the margin can't access a better life. Mm-hmm. That's not right. When you live with that pressure every single day, it changes you. It changes how you perceive things. So what I'm going to tell you is this. I respect the elite institutions. I think they are wonderful. But until they really want to dive into this, I'm not asking them for anything, right? I'm not asking them to lead. I am asking them for something. Follow me, right? Follow us. Let us show you the path where you actually engage in this stuff. Because until we own the fact that the problem, we have people out here who can't eat.
Absolutely.
Right? We have students who have nowhere to go when classes end, who eat in food pantries, right? The reason we turned our football field into a farm was because we were in a neighborhood that was closer to a garbage dump than a grocery store, right? Like when that's your reality, it is different.
But so are there practices, so I mentioned unpaid internships.
That's just a horrible idea.
Yeah, but are there other practices? And yet they remain widespread despite
no, they
periodic
are.
practice.
And let me tell you.
What other things do employers do that they should stop doing?
Well, first of all, employers will provide paid internships.
Right.
Right? Like, listen, we are a work college. Employers pay our students pay us $8,500 for a school year, 2 semesters of our students' time. $7,000 of that $8,500 goes directly to our students, either in their pockets or to help them pay tuition and fees, right? Like, the reality of it is the system exists because we allowed the system to exist. If people stop taking unpaid internships, they stop giving unpaid internships, right? Like, this is the reality. When we provide, I'm sorry, like, this is so frustrating, right? But do you know what it's like to have incredibly gifted students who see an internship opportunity, want the internship, are qualified for the internship, would excel in the internship. Then they get to the line that says this is an unpaid internship.
Right.
You might as well just smack them in the face because you have said to them they don't belong. Right? And this student deserves to belong. But where is it written that they should have to work 3 jobs in the summer just to give away their time and effort? Like, that's just not right. And I don't think we should be okay with it. I'm not okay with it. I don't think anyone else should be okay. And if you're okay with it, it's because you can afford for your children to work for free.
And I will add, let's be clear that these employers need our students to be their interns. They do get a benefit from the talents they are bringing to them. Yeah. They are the ones that know how to do the Twitter. They are the ones that know how to get into the communities that they want to get into. They're the ones that want to give them advice.
I feel like we need to be snapping on all this.
Yeah, I hear the snapping. I hear this. I mean, let's be clear that they get a huge benefit at a very low cost for their internships because they are not paying benefits. Let's remember how high the benefits are. And they are paying the minimal for an internship to get extreme talent, not only the academic skills, but the soft skills and the entree into communities that because they are so elite, they can't get into.
This is about the common good.
No question.
Right? I mean, this is, I'm Jesuit educated, so they told us and brainwashed us with the common good, right? Like, this is about the common good. Just because you can make a lot of money doing something doesn't mean you should.
So I want to open this up to you in the audience, and we have people with mics, so if you could raise your hands if you have a question, and introduce yourself before you ask. Any questions? Everyone is really...
They all went to elite institutions.
You all went, yeah.
Hey, I did not. I started at a community college. I was the one that lived in a housing project, and I was the one that had to break up a chock full of nuts sandwich in 4 pieces to share with my friends. So I get...
So here, we have a question.
Good morning. Talia Givens, the Senior Director for Student Professional Development at UNCF, United Negro College Fund. My question is around the college accreditation process, because colleges are going to create their system, their curriculum, to ensure that they stay open and are accredited. So how do we impact accreditation to get the colleges to make those shifts and changes that bring the relevance, that are preparing students for actual jobs post-graduation, because the rubber meets the road when they want to keep the doors open and they want to stay accredited?
So having been on the WASC Commission, I think they're there already. I think that they look at what is your mission and what do you say you're going to do in order to move the students to graduation. And if we're saying we're being more intentional, then that's what they measure. So I think the WASC Commission in particular that I can speak to, they are there. They are saying, what do you say you're doing, and let us see if you can do it. And they are prepared for the re-engineering, the refocus, the intentionality that we're talking about.
I would just say, to your point, you look at the transformation in healthcare and the role of patient satisfaction surveys. You look at the customer satisfaction surveys of higher ed. If you have a consumer voice and can inject that into the other ecosystem and measures and things that are holding people accountable, and if you let other consumers see that measurement and that voice, that empowers them to make choices. The marketplace moves. You have information for consumers. You have some accountability for institutions to the people who are paying to be there. and investing their lives in that opportunity. And so there's power for change as we, I think, to your point, are humble and listen.
You know, I would take a little more cynical answer to your question, because I actually see the accreditors asking a lot about learning outcomes. And certainly compared to a generation ago, colleges pretty much in every region have to say, these are how we're measuring learning outcomes. But that's not the same as the things that I think we're talking about here today. I think the accreditors are good if you are say a nursing college or a teacher ed program and all of your graduates fail the state licensure exam. They look at that, they take that, but that's as much because they view it as a learning outcome as a life outcome. And so I'm not sure if a college doesn't declare that its goal is careers, I'm not sure the accreditor would ask questions about that.
They won't.
Yeah.
The accreditation is not looking at those things, but if we say we're going to do it, then you're absolutely right. But this is not about accreditation. We're going to be accredited. This is about how do we serve the students that we say that enter into our doors and help them get that career and that next step and have productive lives. That's what this is about. This is about how do we transform, and while accreditation is important, yeah, it's important, but they're not going to look for that.
Please.
I would look at this a little bit differently. Accreditation is a peer-driven process, okay? My estimation of higher education peers is that folks are aspiring, the majority of institutions are aspiring to dominance on US News and World Report. So they're going to track the behavior of those institutions that are rewarded by signature placements on US News and World Report. So that means they have literally no incentive to do anything particularly innovative, like really innovative, because that type of disruption won't be rewarded by US News rankings. And look, the marketplace embraces those rankings. So I get it, I see the thing, but I'm just merely answering what I think is the fundamental flaw in accreditation change. I don't think accreditors really are incentivized to make wholesale changes unless there's extreme external pressure which causes them to do so.
So I'm going to disagree a little with you, because ASCII institutions are not the ones that are looking at US News and World Report, because we are not those elite institutions or research institutions.
So how many institutions are in ASCII?
Over 424.
So ASCII, which is amazing, you know, and I love ASCII, I love what you guys do.
49% of the students that graduate with bachelor's degrees, okay?
Right.
Okay.
So I'm with you, right? But I'm saying that unless those institutions push these guys to make those changes,
Right.
And that's my
And
point.
there's the push is coming not only from people with Strada and Gallup and all of us who are thinking that way. This push is coming from the public, the state legislators, and the Board of Trustees.
And that's my point.
Important.
That's my point.
And that's important to keep us real.
External pressure is what will provide the change in this area, right?
Other questions? Yes.
Robin Ince. I'm a Vice President, Education Policy and Advocacy at the National Urban League. I have a thought and then a question. As I reflect on this first generation conversation, I reflect on the fact that I am descended from people who were enslaved in this country. And in my walk has been made possible by the fact that we had support programs undergirding my family. So my father was able to attend college on our ROTC scholarship. He went to an HBCU. My mother, the first out of her family to go to college, went to community college first and then our state university. I went to an HBCU because I got a scholarship. I got access to that elite HBCU because I was caught up in a program called Inroads that gave me exposure, et cetera, et cetera. So I think as we think about people being able to operate in spaces of privilege and elitism, particularly given their history, which is important to know. One might not be first generation, but one might be pursuing opportunity that is coming from generations of struggle that has not yet been satisfied. So we have to keep that in mind as people are striving for opportunity. So that's my statement. And I am operating from privilege, but that privilege is a hard-fought privilege that I now, as the mother of an African-American son who is operating outside of my home community and home region, am struggling to make sure that he gets to operate in a place of opportunity, not privilege, in this country that he deserves. So that's my statement. My question is regarding internships. As people pursue internships, have either of your institutions, or do you know of institutions that have provided funding support to undergird the opportunity for young people to be able to take an internship that perhaps is outside of their region and requires the underwriting of housing support? We work on providing those opportunities to young people who come out of our programs, but is there any university you know that has taken sort of an intentional approach to saying yes to a paid internship possible when one has to pay for travel, housing, et cetera?
We annually, 85 to 90% of our students are on Pell Grants. 70% of our students have zero expected family contributions. We live in the day-to-day reality that anything we want our students to do, we have to help them pay for. So we are very intentional about that.
So the institutions that ask you also, and basically many presidents and their university advancement teams raise dollars especially for that, in order for students who are first gen, low income, don't have the money, but have to have the opportunities that we can really fund going and staying in Washington, D.C., for example, and the housing, et cetera, and still have that paid internship. But you mentioned something that we haven't talked about that I think is so important to this study, that first generation college students come into not knowing what careers they're really going to go into because they don't know the options and opportunities before them. So, you know, when you think about, you hear about a doctor, you hear about a lawyer, you hear about a nurse, and you hear about not wanting to work in the fields or work in factories. But what else is out there? What do you do with these degrees? And so that's why it is so critical for those of us who are serving the majority of America to make sure that they are understanding the wonderful world of opportunities of careers and help them see that through internships and strategic directions with support services.
And on a related, Robin, thank you for your statement and your question. Strada is working with the Jackie Robinson Foundation as one example. They're scholars, but really to fund the expansion of that community to go from those who are able to have the in-person community experience to an online platform that brings that same strength and network and community. So regardless of which institution you're attending, you can be a part of that affirming community of peers that give you vision and leadership and help you taste it. So it doesn't have to be place-based. You can be wherever you are. And so those types of initiatives and innovations around not only the delivery, but how do we support our individuals in our communities in their aspirations.
And I think it's also really important to think about not just the financial pressures, which are real to live, but the guidance provided. And I think about, you know, and again, look at what the new research says about the importance of internships in students' experience. I had a great intern from a non-elite institution who I unthinkingly assigned to do an article about a play at a Washington area theater that dealt with a theme about higher education, so I wanted him to cover it. So I said, you know, just go, you know, call, get a press pass, and then go to the play, and then you'll write about it. And he came back to me 5 minutes, he goes, I've never been to a theater.
Right.
And this is the kind of thing that if we're going to be serious about opportunities, and again, inside hire is kind of weird that we would actually send somebody to a play, but there are a range of experiences that we would expect of interns and of new employees that if you don't pause and think about it and explain, and look, he was perfectly capable of doing it, did a great story, but there are things he didn't know. And they weren't things about smarts, they were things about experience. And how do we provide them as colleges and as employers? I think we have time for one more quick question there.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Morgan from the National College Access Network. Dave, this is for you. I wanted to ask if at some point the rich information that you're gaining from the Gallup surveying, will you be able to help provide students with feedback about specific institutions, either a range of institutions and the experiences consumers have had with those, or at least maybe the sort of bright spot institutions where folks are having particularly good experiences?
Elizabeth, and I think the goal is not for us to tell students what those institutions are, but for consumers to tell other consumers what their experience has been. And so that's very much the power, ultimately the ultimate highest power and value of this effort that Strada has made and with our partner Gallup is to give institutions and give consumers and give employers visibility into what that subjective experience is, so that we're no longer just talking about students, but we're talking with them and we're hearing their voices in a way that is not just the disgruntled or the ecstatic who fill out the voluntary comment card, but is rigorous and scientifically based and built so that we have confidence in those ratings. I don't rate my Uber drivers. Brandon rates every single one, but I don't. And so my rating doesn't show up. But when you do rigorous sampling and surveying, then you have confidence that what you're giving to people is not shame, and it's not blame, and it's not a silver bullet. It's solid information that then individuals and institutions can make their own choices about how to act and what to do with that. And hopefully, in the spirit of what we've heard here today, that lift for individuals and for our community and our nation ultimately.
So we're going to do a panel switch here now, but don't go anywhere because this is going to be speedy. But please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you. And while our next panel is coming up, just to follow on that question, I think in some ways law schools may be worth looking at as the sort of canary in the coal mine in this, because there's a lot of surveys of law school grads on employment, debt, and quality of career preparation, and most law schools are doing fairly miserably. So now we're going to switch to a panel of people representing government and the business world. And if they were listening backstage, I know none of these people are going to admit to ever knowing anyone who offers unpaid internships. And
talk about Congress first.
we talk about Congress. Yeah, we could start with Congress, but we're going to talk now on sort of the business and policy perspective of these same issues. And at my far left, we have Jeremy Anderson, who's president of the Education Commission of the States. If you don't know ECS, it's a really important organization that brings together state policymakers and educators and has done a lot of very thoughtful work on that area. Then to his left, we have Sarah Bowder, who's the Chief Transformation Officer of the Society for Human Resource Management, in other words, the National Association of HR People, she brings that perspective. And then we have Cheryl Oldham, who's Senior Vice President for Education Policy of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So I want to start, we got in a few digs on the business and policy world in the previous panel. I want to start by asking you all, from your perspective, does higher ed get it? Is higher ed doing the right things in light of the kind of research that we heard presented here today? Cheryl, do you want to start?
Oh boy, let me start. You know what, I'll start by saying, first, thank you all for inviting me to be here and share my perspective. You know, once upon a time, 100 years ago, I worked on a report called the Spellings Commission. And one of the things we started out talking about was just saying there's enough blame to go around, right? Like, it's not useful for the employers to constantly sit back and point the finger and, you know, higher ed at K-12. And so, you know, sort of our goal in that was to really bring everybody to the table and say, look, there's just enough we all need to be doing. So I guess I should start by saying that, and the approach that we take at the Chamber is to say, look, employers are not perfect in this world, right? We have not clearly signaled. We don't always say exactly what we need or want. And so we're trying with Strada's help and others' help to really to fix that, sort of get our house in order, right? So I think, so does higher ed get it? Not entirely. Do employers get it? Not entirely. I think we all have work to do, and you know, we were sort of backstage listening to the conversation and thinking, you know, accreditation would be maybe a great place to start in this. And that then obviously includes policymakers as well. Do they get it? And what changes need to happen there?
Sarah?
So first of all, again, thank you. I think this is great to take the consumer student perspective and actually do a backward, you know, rear view mirror look and say, what was the relevance of education? So I have so many notes that I took, and so I'm going to try to narrow it down to 3. One is I think we need to talk about the skills gap, and I don't mean the skills gap in terms of after you graduate from college, what are the jobs that need to be filled? I want to say, okay, we're taking an individual, they're looking back at their own perception of the value of the courses they took relative to the job market. Did they know themselves? What skills did they have? What were the expectations? Because I worked in higher ed for 25 years, and the students that started off with general education, I would say, so what are you good at? They didn't know their own skills. And so when we read about, like I just did Strength Finders a few years ago, and it really gave me insights to who I am and how do you sit in your own individual skills. So my first thought is we put a lot of pressure on higher education, rightfully so. They are the gateway into the job market, but we need to also put some responsibility into the consumer in terms of if we think of them as the consumer, what are they buying? And what is your responsibility to yourself? The second comment I have is whoever talked about accreditation, brilliant comment. I think it's actually crucial and critical to where we're going, because if we think about intellectual property can be gained anywhere, regardless of, you know, so this survey looked at 18 to 65-year-olds. Really, if we look at the arc of where we're going in terms of intellectual property, if I want to, you could think about this. If I want to be a PowerPoint expert, I can go to YouTube, learn it all I want. I can go on to Taskmaster, put myself out there, and I can do crowdsourcing, accreditation based on people who give me some type of value. And so that's a really interesting model when you think about higher ed, of how are we thinking about when you go into the job market, the employers are looking at what do you know and what can you do? That's really, and can you do it well? And so then the third I would say is we really need to make sure that we have lifelong learning. And when I think of the purpose of higher ed is, did it teach me how to learn? I have a English degree and I'm in higher ed. I mean, I'm in HR, and you go, okay, I would have never thought that, but really we have a job lattice. We don't have a career ladder anymore. And do you have the skill sets to jump from job to job? And that goes back to the soft skills.
Jeremy?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity out there when we look at, does higher ed get it? And I think we need to ask all across the board, do employers truly understand what their needs are 5 years from now, and are they articulating that back to higher ed and to policymakers? And I think it's really important that we look at the policymakers in the states, here in DC also, but we're at a juncture with these 2018 elections that we've got 36 governor's races that are going to take place across the country. And if you count the new governors that came in 2017, by January, we will have at least guaranteed 60% of our governors with less than 23 months experience on the job. So how are we getting this kind of information about students' needs to those policymakers so that they can truly start to think about where could they make a difference with some of the skills gap that Sarah's talking about, or some of the business needs that Cheryl represents so well with the chamber? I think there's a real pivotal moment here in America where this kind of information from the students on figuring out what do they need, where do they really see the opportunities for growth, how do we get that articulated to an incoming governor, to a new member who is elected to the state legislature, or to a new chief state school officer or state higher ed exec who can start to have those statewide conversations. Because right now, from the experience we see nationally, they're happening in small pockets, but there's really not a discussion going on like this in every state, and there probably should be for both higher ed and for the business community.
Well, and how can you just change that political discussion? Because I guess as I think about when that discussion from state policymakers makes headlines, It's generally because the governor has said, we don't need French majors anymore, or let's stop teaching anthropology. It's not, let's create the set of conditions that we are talking about here. How do you shift the conversation?
I think some of the conversation needs to be shifted by sharing more of this data on what the student outcomes are and what they're looking for. We shouldn't have French degrees if that's the comment that's coming from a state. Normally that's in the context of there has to be budget cuts and we need to get rid of certain degrees. That might be a short-term decision that has to be made because of revenues for this quarter or this year. It's not the long-term decision that needs to be made for state policy on where are we going to invest to have the workforce and skills needed to succeed in a 21st century economy. And I think that's where there's a lot of opportunity for this consumer information to be shared with policymakers, to be planning not for maybe the 2019 or 2020 budget, but to be planning for where they're going to be with their workforce in 2030.
Cheryl, you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to piggyback on that and say this whole conversation really needs to be a conversation that is state or community or regional level. The idea that we have these sort of conversations at a national level about skills that we need or jobs that are available is just, in my opinion, useless, right? Like, this is not a helpful conversation to be talking about, 50,000, I don't know, RN positions we need to fill. And then all sorts of scrambling around trying to create the pathways to fill those jobs. And it's just different everywhere, right? And so maybe they don't need French in wherever. I mean, I don't know, whatever the example is, but that conversation about what is needed, what are employers looking for, what are the jobs in that region, in that state, in that community, and what's growing, and where are there opportunity for young people to actually have a job and a career and a life. And all of that, as mobile of a society as we are, people don't really, generally don't go that far, right? A lot of times. And so it's really important to know what is happening right then and there. And, these sort of conversations at the national level, I guess, help us to frame out a broader problem that we might be struggling with as a nation, but really looking at solutions needs to happen so much more locally and with local employers. And I was sort of thinking about that backstage as folks were talking about, we need employer engagement and employers aren't engaged, or whatever the conversation is. And I say they are, actually. They really are, and we're helping them to become more and more, but having a sort of, thinking about sort of an elite employer, whoever that conjures up in your mind, it's really not so much about them. It's more about what's happening really locally. And so, anyway, I digress.
Sarah?
Yeah, so I totally agree. I do think it's at the local level, but I do think employers are responsible for putting a hand back into higher ed and saying, here are the skill sets that we actually need for the future. And I do think, to the panel before, that it's moving into the soft skills, because technology is just changing the underlying repetitive, redundant skill that machine learning can do. And so to bring the human back into the workplace is really to teach those soft skills that are transferable across the workforce. And what does that actually look like? I would add, though, so working at SHRM, I've been there all of 5 weeks. Yeah, but it's been a really good experience, because my vision of what HR actually did is totally different. I thought HR was the department down the hallway nobody walked into, and if you did walk into it, it was like the gossip mill, like she went into HR. And it's not. It's like a totally different world, and it's so amazing in terms of SHRM is actually at a pivotal point of being able to change how we optimize HR in terms of we need someone who does the legal side of this, that it's very regulated. But also then, how do you build the human potential? You have to cultivate human potential the whole way from the pre-professional the whole way up to retired. And that's where I think maybe HR hasn't done as good a job as it should be, and I think we have a great opportunity to bring forth humans and uplift them in very different ways. And so an $8 billion industry is professional development. And so how are employers actually thinking about professional development? And should it be those funds are actually put back into higher ed and maybe even high school and building up those skill sets for a much longer arc so that we have the skill sets earlier on and we have much more sustainability in the workplace?
So, Jeremy, please.
Well, and Sarah, I just add to that, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I think there are employers that are engaged. We need more employers engaged in giving that longer roadmap saying, here are the skills we need 5 years from now. We also need HR to be helping to give a little bit of guidance on some of these policymakers saying, we need these kind of skills and how can we assist you in putting that together? But also when you look at states, we've got to figure out how to share what an education means. I mean, far too often, universities, colleges, they do a great job getting to an accredited degree. But does that degree have everything that the employer needs for that employee to have as far as skills? That's not what we hear from a lot of employers. And so how do you figure out where that gap is? The National Student Clearinghouse has done a lot of work on some of this, but we all have a financial score that we can pull down online anywhere that shows all of our financial information back to that credit card I had in college. How do we have an education portfolio that you could track? How do we have an online place that shows even like attending this event here has some learning capacity? Does that get put into an education portfolio that employers and that others can look at to see where we're getting those skills? And I think there's a lot of opportunity with technology to do this, but it hasn't been something that's been engaged in a lot with employers and with states.
Yeah, that's
well Cheryl?
Yeah, I was gonna just give a little anecdote. We've been, for the past 3 or 4 years, we're standing up a project called Talent Pipeline Management with support of Strada Education Network, and it started as an idea. It is now a movement, and it's really gaining momentum. But the idea is to really work with employers to give them the tools, the resources, the strategies to figure out what do they really need? What are the competencies they need? What are the skills? What are the credential requirements? How do they sort of get together as employers and do that homework on the front end before they come into a partnership with an educational workforce provider? So to be very clear, just, as I started out saying, we're not perfect. We haven't been very clear. But what was really interesting, one of our biggest partners is the state of Kentucky and the Kentucky Chamber, and they are really embracing this approach for the entire state. And it really hit me the other day talking to them, and they made this comment. We know 90% of everything we need to know about the people in Kentucky, sort of where they went to school, where they are, where they're employed. We know about 30% of what employers actually need in terms of what are the jobs, what are the skills. So there's this huge gap. We know, Kentucky has a very, renowned, I guess, if that's the word to describe a data system. But it's very sophisticated data system, but it doesn't have the really important piece. So they're like, we're spending hundreds of millions, if not, hundreds of millions of dollars in the state of Kentucky to train people for what? So we don't even know. So they are using the approach that the Chamber Foundation and Strada have built to say, okay, we're gonna figure that out. This is not easy stuff. This is not like, oh, just employers tell us what you need. This is not easy stuff. They have used bachelor's degrees and other things for years as a proxy to mean something. And by and large, or more and more as we see through Gallup and other, okay, that's maybe not working so well for us.
So I want to go back to what accreditation gives in certain fields. Yeah. In health professions, in law, in teaching, however flawed it is, there is some consensus on what a new nurse should know. And it's sort of reflected in a state licensure requirement and a specialized accrediting requirement. But in all other fields, there is nothing like that. And so whereas in those fields, a bachelor's degree or a master's degree has to conform with some standards that have been set, in most fields, there's nothing. And so I want to maybe use the Kentucky example. How do you go about that? Because there's no requirement that a given college conform.
No, but here's an example they used, engineering is one where there is, right? So, but they still have an issue in rural Kentucky where they can recruit engineers to companies, but they don't stay, right? They come from out of state, they stay for 5 minutes, and then they leave, right? Get a little bit of experience and leave, and they're really struggling. And so they've realized, okay, we need to build it here in rural Kentucky with higher ed providers in rural Kentucky to be what we need. And they haven't, I think they have something, but not exactly what they need. So it really does require the employers doing this work that they are undertaking in the state and then developing those partnerships. Who are my preferred providers? I'm going to do the work. I'm going to do the back mapping within my organization or set of enterprises, of companies, and saying, okay, I'm going to analyze my talent flows. Where do they come from? Who does a really good job for me? And oh, by the way, if you weren't doing a really good job for me, I'm going to go back to those institutions and tell you you're not, and I may not recruit from you anymore. Boeing's a great example who they've sort of been doing this for several years. Rick Stevens started it, Boeing, with their engineering program, is really intentionally looking at where their engineers came from and saying, you know what, I'm not coming to you anymore because what you're giving me is not what I need. And boy, that makes, I think, higher ed take a look.
Or,
Sarah?
yeah, I totally agree with you, and I think you could look at it both ways when you think of the broader ecosystem. Take Stevens Institute of Technology and their president, Nariman Favardan. He actually went to all of the local companies and said, what skills do you need, and how can we partner together to actually work to make sure that my graduates, he wants 100% graduation. So it's a really interesting model, but it's, we talk about this, if you would have, longitudinal timeline, you have elementary, middle school, high school, college, job, and it's really not that way anymore. It's very, we need to get into that it's a mixed model and that we have the ecosystem and all the champions working together.
I mean, leadership key, right? I mean,
That's
I think
right.
it was said,
Yeah.
it was, evidence in the last panel as well. I mean, when you have leaders either on the employer side or the chamber side who are getting employers together and really doing the hard work, or the leaders at the policymaker level or the leaders at the higher ed level, not everyone is going to get it. But we
So
need
should the
to
Boeings of the
cultivate
world,
those.
thinking back to what Brandon was talking about, consumer ideas here, should the Boeings of the world put something on their website that says, we've stopped recruiting at these colleges because we don't do well with their graduates?
Wow, that would be provocative.
I don't know. I mean, it'd be interesting. Rick Stevens isn't there anymore. I don't know. He was never shy about it. I mean, I don't know if he was saying it necessarily, shouting it from the website, but he was pretty, I think he was pretty transparent about.
It would be interesting to do sort of a crowd, I'm throwing a provocative thought out, based on this survey. Okay, we went back and asked individuals about their course selection, what was the impact of actually doing crowdsourcing around that, around each institution, what would the grade value be? I totally agree with the last panel that how we evaluate higher ed based on US News and World Report and all of these proxies are outdated and keep higher ed entrenched in their 1,000-year tradition-bound industry. And we need to change that.
And I think, back to the accreditation piece, we put out a piece probably a year and a half ago, just trying to kind of put out there as a thought piece, not tied to Title IV, at least initially, is what could an employer quality assurance system look like that higher ed and others would respond to. I mean, why, and so it's something that, we did something more recently in partnership with the Manufacturing Institute around quality pathways, again, kind of in the earn and learn model, in the earn and learn space, but what would a truly industry-led approach to that, looking at, quality assurance from the employer side. And so that's something that we're going to continue to push and pursue. I mean, I think that's, that's the future. And again, not something that's going to happen overnight.
Jeremy?
Well, and I think accreditation does matter. And there's a reason that we need to have a standard for what does an RN degree bring or what does a law degree bring. But as Brandon highlighted from some of the consumers and the students, I mean, those that had the specificity of a certain degree or certification had a better relevance in their job and what that meant to them. And so we have a host of other issues that employers are looking for. I don't know what the accreditation is for a problem solver. But that's what I hear businesses saying, I need more problem solvers. So there wasn't that degree when I was in college. I don't think there is now as my son is in college, but we need to figure out how to merge that communication side. I think the consumer survey certainly helps there, but how do businesses help us know what those skills are, and how do we look at what is required to have that either as an accredited or a certificate that can be guaranteed?
Is business consistent though? Because most surveys that I see of business leaders have them talking about things like just what you and others have said, soft skills more than majors, or more than specific programs of study. And yet in this discussion and the public discourse, a lot of it is, why don't we have more fill in the blanks majors? I don't recall a big push by a lot of business leaders on critical thinking, even if they answer that way in surveys.
Yeah, totally agree with you on that. I mean, it goes back to the T-shaped learner that, you know, there's all these critical thinking, all the soft skills across are super important, but there's also subject matter expertise. To Brandon's comment, I mean, he said not everybody can get into a vocation, but that is a subject matter expertise. But we also need these soft skills. But as much as it's said and as much as it's written about, it's not actually practiced.
And I think if you look at some of the positions that are out there, just if you look at what's advertised in certain communities, I mean, there are a host of positions that are managers of local shops that are going on at a strip mall that require a bachelor's degree. Are the skills from a bachelor's degree linked to being a manager of a local Gap store? I don't know, but they're allowed to put that down in certain ways, and I'm not sure we're actually having the articulated skills that are necessary for success in even the job descriptions that are posted, which leads those people who don't feel that their degree was relevant or others to maybe get into the wrong industry, wrong area, because we're not even communicating what the needs are well. There's a real opportunity for some change there.
Yeah.
We have recently announced a project, title right now, job registry project, but it really is getting at, it's not just, so we obviously have a real skills gap, we believe, so, you know, certain set of skills needed, not enough people that have those skills, but there's also an issue of signaling, and are we missing each other in the process, and it's almost a plumbing issue, it's a data issue, it's about how we talk about the skills that we need, our job postings, are the web document, you know, the Word document that we're putting up, do our HRIS systems and applicant tracking systems able to connect? Are they missing each other because the words aren't the same? And so that is, again, another, like, this is how we fix the broader issues, and they're not, you know, super sexy, and but that's also where we're running into problems, and so we're taking it on.
I want to shift back to questions, and Carol from Strada is also going to be available to answer questions during this round as well. Jamie, I missed you last time. Did you want to start off with a question? Do we have our mics?
Yeah, I don't know that I need to stand up since I'm right here. So my name is Jamie Schwartz. I work with the American Indian College Fund. And we primarily work with communities that are rural and remote, where economies have consistently struggled and access to meaningful employment opportunities are scarce. So I was interested in how the panel sees the role of higher education in entrepreneurship and creating job creation, in addition to connecting employers and meaningful employment opportunities to places where they don't necessarily exist. It seems like a lot of these conversations really focus around urban centers and not really consider that where the largest employers aren't necessarily where everyone is located.
I mean, that certainly is a struggle, and it's sort of separate project, not in my specific wheelhouse at the Chamber, but something that Chamber is very committed to, and our CEO in particularly is very passionate about, and it's this issue of bringing jobs to places where there aren't any. Sort of distressed communities is his focus, and really identifying there's plenty in this country, and how do we bring whatever we can, whatever leverage, whatever push we can from the chamber to our members and others, and say to them, what are you going to do to bring jobs to these communities, and really, it's a hard sell, right? Why would you do something you weren't going to do? And so, but again, it's something that our folks are trying to figure out and take on, and I mean, this is a real serious problem, is how do we get jobs in places where there aren't. We don't have all the answers, but we're working on it.
I think technology can play some components in this. I mean, there are a lot of jobs where you think about location may not matter as much. I mean, my IT director, our office is in Denver, Colorado. I've got 50 staff there. Our IT director is in a remote community in Iowa, and she's amazing, and she does great work. But if we have the skills that people are getting, there are some of those jobs where you can make that work. And I can tell you in a lot of states that are primarily more of a brain drain kind of scenario, where their best and brightest are leaving the state to go somewhere else, they're looking for those kind of opportunities to be able to get those skills within those small rural communities, so that they can then tell different employers, we have the skills you need, and you don't even have to pay for the overhead for offices. I mean, there's a real opportunity there, but it's going to take, at least from state government side, it's going to take a governor and a secretary of labor and the secretary of education and the universities talking together about how do we build this, because it doesn't happen overnight.
But it strikes me that this trend is very strong. I mean, I'm thinking about all the articles about the Amazon search for the new location, which is just an unusually public process. And if you think about the proposals and the finalists, even though they were being criticized in some cases for being in cities with high housing costs, they were all urban areas. I'm trying to, at least the finalists were all major metro areas. So it does seem like the trends are very much in that direction. I don't know, Carol, did you want to add anything on this? Or no? Okay.
Yeah, the other thing I would add is, diversity and inclusion is a rising conversation among the job marketplace. And I think you ask a really complex question, but a pertinent question for employers, is to think, how is it they're changing, bringing more inclusion into the marketplace? And I used to work for the Gates Foundation, and we had a scholarship, and the complexity that we had in terms of building a more diverse marketplace, it's very difficult. So it's I think a crucial question to ask employers.
Other questions? Yes, there, please.
Thank you. I'm Tom Gensel, Executive Director at the National School Boards Association. First of all, thank you to Gallup and Strada for this. It's an outstanding session. I'm going to pick up on what Cheryl said. There's a lot of blame and I think a lot of opportunity to go around. And one of the things we're really focused on is what can we do in K-12 education to try to address and help prepare students for life after they graduate. So in some ways, I think we're obviously very proud of the fact that we see graduation rates going up. I think we're educating more students to a much higher level than ever before. But after giving ourselves this pat on the back, we know there's a real issue, and Brandon touched on it, 6+ million jobs that are going wanting. My question, I think, is a policy question, and it's a systems question. So what are your thoughts about how we can bring all of this together, the K-12 system, higher education, the business community, to really work on it together and find some common ground? And I want to pick up also on Cheryl's point about definitions, because I do worry a little bit that some folks are talking past each other with good intent, but not necessarily hearing what each other is saying. So from a systems point of view, what do you think we can do?
Jeremy?
I think there's a lot from a systems, and the policy needs to be considered. And school boards have done a great job in a lot of states, but there is a disconnect. We brought a bunch of states together, and you had to bring somebody from the governor's office, somebody from your state higher ed office, the chief state school officer or superintendent of education had to be there, and a legislator. And this was on the transition to college. How do we make that pipeline easier for students? It was amazing to listen to some of these states as they were together. First of all, some of those players, they know of each other, but they hadn't seen each other since the governor's last holiday party because they're busy and they're working in their own silos respectfully. But I remember one specifically where the question we had was, do you have an agreed upon definition of what college and career ready means? And the legislators said, no, we had a resolution a couple years ago. And the state higher ed exec said, yeah, I think we have one, but they didn't have it. And the chief said, yes, our state board passed it 2 years ago. None of them had even compared their definitions together. And so there is a need at the state level and then down at regional levels for some defined plans to start with what is college and career ready? How are we preparing those students? And does that start their senior year of high school or does that start in 6th grade? And how do we make that a transition so that they can get to that success point? The other thing that needs to happen in a lot of states is we need to have more of these cross-functional communications going on.
That's right.
I say this all the time when I'm out in states, but it is rare that the chief state school officer and the state higher ed executive are talking daily. But shouldn't they be? I mean, the chief state school officer is preparing all of these students to graduate high school so they can go and get a job or get into a higher ed institution. And higher ed in that state is trying to figure out who are going to be going to their universities and what can they prepare them for. There's a couple of states where this is done well. I mean, I know one chief and SHIO in a state where I think they text each other probably 7 times a day. That's awesome. But in many states, that communication isn't happening, and there's a real opportunity for that to be opened up so that we can really think through the policy opportunities that states could consider.
We did the commission, it was 2005, and so that was 13 years ago now. And it was, I think Charlie Reid might have been the only person at the time at the CSU system that was aligning entrance to his colleges in California with what was coming out of high schools. And he was going to churches and he was talking to anybody who would listen to him about how to do this. I think maybe there's a little bit more of that happening now, but I mean, that was 13 years ago, right? I mean, there's probably not enough of that happening, that really clear connection. And then to your point about the college and career readiness definition, I mean, this is, Jeremy and I have been in a few conversations recently around this stuff. I fear now that, so we, have a Every Student Succeeds Act, and we have, 49 states, I think. I really need to look in to figure out what the one state is that doesn't have something in their accountability system related to college and career readiness. But what does that look like? So it's in your accountability system, so it's going to be the thing that you're measured on. So it's probably going to be the thing that people pay attention to. And then it's also going to be the thing that states then can come out and say, oh, we have this many college and career ready, we graduated X percentage college and career ready based on what? And mostly it's maybe access to industry recognized credentials or access to rigorous coursework, or maybe a career, a CTE course of study. A lot of it's access related. It's not always completion related. Anyway, you probably have more.
No, and there's a lot of that which we should be looking at. I mean, we've got a bunch of reports on our website, and we've been working through this, but we should be talking with a lot of these states on, do you have a college and career ready definition? Also, we should be looking at the data. I mean, how many of us see high schools that brag that 96% of their high school graduates got a scholarship or went to college? But what they aren't saying is, our graduates 6 years ago, this percentage have some kind of a degree or certification after high school. We have that data. I mean, it's out there. Why aren't we tracking that from a state perspective? I also think it's really important for us to step back a little bit and say, what are we doing if we have a child that fails after high school? We only have about 20 states in America right now that have reverse transfer programs, which would mean if I drop out for some life reason of a university or community college, that I have the ability to reverse transfer to a different institution. We have a host of people who may have 60 credit hours at the four-year institution. They drop out and they have nothing, but why don't we have a reverse transfer policy in those states that allow them to go back to the community college, take 6 more credit hours, and have an associate's degree, which probably is a life-changing situation for them as far as their career trajectory. And so there's some of these policies that, a reverse transfer program doesn't cost any money. That's an easy thing to put in place in states. But it's hard to get those things moving if there's not open communication between higher ed and K-12 and some of the policymakers on how do we create the workforce for the future for the next 10 years in our state or region.
Carol, did you want to say anything? Okay. So I guess the thing I would also draw attention to is college counselors in high schools.
Yeah.
We recently wrote about KIPP schools changed the job description for their college counselors to, I'm going to botch the name, college to life counselors or something like that. And they explicitly charged them, and these are counselors who work in schools with many low income and disadvantaged students, to coach their students not to look for the most prestigious college, but the colleges with the best track record at graduating low-income students. And that's not necessarily the same as the most prestigious colleges. And to talk about these issues of career preparation. And then finally, while it's true, there are a lot of things that don't cost money. If you want to look at what states do, look at the ratio of students to counselors in high schools. The numbers are very, very different from state to state. And where these ratios are most dangerous, I would say, to students' future is for low-income students who can't go to their parents. I mean, it should concern people that the norm for upper middle class families at this point is to hire a private counselor, but then think about, well, who can't afford to do that? So it's not the, and this is something that has a direct implication on the courses students take in high school to become prepared for college or career and their college choices, and vast inequities largely ignored from state and district to district.
You know, there was a program in Virginia. I was talking with Timothy Sands, who is the president of Virginia Tech, and I know enough to talk about it, but you'd have to do deeper research on it. But they started a B to 20 program, and B at birth, working with the hospitals and teaching parents the value of reading to your children and how that actually impacts career development. And so you might want to, great question on how K-12 can help. I think it's also looking the reverse direction, not up, but looking back at when kids are born.
And there's a lot of policies and programs across the country that we should be looking at to see how they succeed. I mean, there's some great work in Tennessee that has free community college because of how they reorganize their student financial aid. Is that going to get the outcomes they desire? They're still waiting to find out, but it's an interesting policy. Louisiana this year, if you're a graduating senior from high school, this is the first year that you can't get your diploma unless you filled out a FAFSA form. That's going to be hard to say you don't get the diploma because mom and dad didn't fill it out. But the theory there is, let's force the conversation, because you may not have had a normal conversation at dinner about what is life after high school in your family. But this will force you to at least look at it, because you'll get a form back and you can say, well, I could go to the community college. I could go to the university. I do have some financial aid to help here. And so there's some of those levers like that I think states have a real opportunity to try to open up some of those doors. And some of them are programs in the community, some are policy levers, some are actually just bringing together those policy leaders and saying, how can we work together for the ultimate goal, which is a more educated and skills-based workforce to meet the needs of our economy.
And the final thing I would say about the K-12 piece in this, I guess a couple of things. One is just that the opportunity for career exposure, and I think it's a little bit to the college counseling conversation. You know, we have been for a long time very focused on sort of the traditional path, college, for a lot of really good reasons. But I think now we're starting to recognize there are lots of, you know, or maybe more accepting of lots of different paths. These are all fraught with with issues that we could spend hours talking about that. But I think I can't go a week without being in a meeting or a conversation talking about how we need to do better with exposing kids, maybe middle through high school, to the wide variety of careers and growing and different and pathways to get there and all of that. And I feel like that's a really good place. And then somebody raised this to me yesterday, and I hadn't really thought about it, and I've just been like thinking about it nonstop since. And we were sort of talking about CTE and lots of focus now on career and technical education, and how do we make sure it's relevant and aligned to industry, and sort of, you know, that specifically happening at the high school level. And the question was raised, why is that? Why are we doing that at high school, right? Like, why can't we just focus that post-high school? If we all agree everybody needs something beyond a high school diploma. The just base high school diploma is not enough anymore, and so something, it's a credential, it's a certificate, it's a something beyond high school. Why are we putting that piece also on the K through 12 system, or the high schools specifically? So I haven't like stopped to form my opinion around it yet, but I thought it was a really interesting question. And would rather high school spend all its time focused on, you know, sort of the core academics piece and getting that piece right?
That's right.
Another question? Yes. Somebody get a mic there?
Hi, thank you. Sue Lane from the New England Board of Higher Education. And we just finished a 50-person commission on employability in higher education. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here, because you're modeling exactly what I think we need to do, which is to have a conversation across policy, higher ed, K-12, employer. And in New England, we think we're big, but we're actually pretty small. And so it's not easy, but easier to work in a region. Mm-hmm. And I also had some experiences working when we've tried to do things nationally and try to standard things, such as a definition of college and career readiness, and we spent a lot of time doing that, and we don't work well together sometimes as a nation. So my question really is, I think our strength is more of a regional approach. And regions are pretty much defined by states, but sometimes there's sections within states. And so I'm trying to find out if you have any thoughts about how we can get from this national picture with all of our acronyms and agencies and make the transition to a regional, so that it's not just individual states. We have a lot of energy with New England states maybe embarrassing each other or challenging each other to move agendas forward and really push the conversation across the number of institutions we have about what does higher ed and employability mean, and how can we have this conversation. But we really need help connecting with business and industry, and some gap between the state level and the national level. And I wonder if you have any strategies or ideas about that in your work. Thank you.
Well, I can speak to what I know in terms of our work with employers. And, you know, we started out with, you know, in our talent pipeline work with an idea and some pilots, and then we transitioned to an academy model where we brought people to DC from all over the country to teach them, and developed a curriculum and all sorts of things. And then we realized that actually the sort of the next phase was we needed to do this more regional approach, more, okay, the sort of national academy model is great and bring people from all over, and they can learn the curriculum and they can learn from each other in a lot of situations. But actually then what they said is, okay, I need you to come to us, I need you to come in my state, and we need to work within our state on this issue. And so that is now how we're working that way, and I think you're right. And to my sort of comments earlier, it's different. And it's different if you're Toyota. What Toyota needs in San Antonio, different from what Toyota needs in Kentucky, right? So like talking about Toyota, maybe not as useful as talking to the, you know, that division in a particular state and the supply chain that it works with, right? And so, yeah, so that's sort of where we are in terms of doing that. And then I think, you know, to the point of, you know, people were mobile, but we don't really go that far, is then, okay, we're working with the employers and we're helping them to really do that hard work. But then there is that, okay, now we have to work with higher ed and with workforce boards and with the training system within the state, and how do we then build those partners once we have sort of done our work? So that's kind of how we're approaching it.
Well, and I think there's a real value to those regional discussions. I think that the important thing is you have to find out how to make that conversation last longer than 3 months. And I mean that respectfully. We have a lot of task forces that pop up and they're done in 3 months or 4 months, maybe a year if you're lucky. We have a significant amount of turnover in policymakers across this country, and that's not going to change. And so how do you set up a commission that maybe is there for 3 years so that even if who's on the commission changes, the focus and the drive of this doesn't? And so, I mean, chief state school officers right now, for a variety of reasons, are averaging about 2.5 years on the job. We've got a host of state higher ed executives that are turning over right now. This isn't a bad thing, but if you've got these leaders turning over that regularly, do they really have time to take an issue like this, which is across silos, and make it a priority? So I think as we have new governors, and as you have chambers, and as you have regional employers, if you can find a way to create that commission for a long period of time, you're probably going to get better outcomes and really be looking at the longer investment in your economy.
Yeah. There's also, though, a really tricky challenge for leaders of colleges. I had a community college president, not from New England, but from a Rust Belt state, tell me that if he wanted to do the best thing for his students, he would be training them for jobs in Florida. But that he can't have an honest discussion about that because he's a community college president, and he would be fired if he did that. And yet, he's seeing his students go elsewhere, not necessarily, and sometimes their education, then they need a little more education to meet the local requirements. And so we are in a very bizarre period where much of the discussion and planning is regional or actually very much state-based, but when the economy is really bad and when it's worse in some parts of the country than others, people will move. And having a discussion about that, I think, is a third rail issue for many places. So now that I'm on the third rail, we are going to shift to our final brief discussion before lunch, but please join me in thanking this panel. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. And Carol, if you want to come back. So Carol, did you have any summing up that you wanted to offer the group?
Well, everybody in my household knows I always try to get the last word, so thank you, Scott. I do want to thank you again for joining us today. It was everything we at Strada had hoped it would be, and that is an intriguing discussion, but it's the beginning of the discussion. I asked a colleague before I came up here, what should I say during the closing remarks? He said, I don't know, but make it really short and really good. So I'm aware that we're a little bit beyond the time, so a lot of pressure to make it really short and really good. I do want to tell you that we believe in consumer insights, so we want to make sure that you know we are going to do an email survey to you asking for your insights about today and how we make future meetings more valuable to you. I do want to acknowledge the chairman of our board has arrived since my morning remarks. I want to thank you, Ed Schmidt, for joining us today. You know, I heard a lot of things, and I hope we can continue the discussion over a very probably short lunch, but one of the things that occurred to me is the affirmation of the importance of the consumer voice. I didn't hear anybody question that or challenge that, so that's affirming for us. I liked Michael Sorrell's reality-based education instead of work-based education. Might want to play around with that. And also the discussion about what is becoming sort of a false choice between this vocationalism of higher education and the more general education. I think what it affirmed for me today is it is a false choice. And when we talk about relevance, we're not talking about narrow vocationalism necessarily. So I thought that was an important discussion. And around the skills and the employer community acknowledging that they need to send good signals about that and are committed to working with us in higher education to do that. And I also want to remind everybody about the importance of the adult population. I was struck by Michael Sorrell talking about the 40,000 adults who are projected to lose their jobs because of automation. And David Clayton telling us that through our Gallup survey, we know that 43% of Americans in their 40s are looking for more education to advance their lives and careers. And I think that's a challenge that we need to continue to address and to discuss. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Scott.
So I was just say just a few quick things that occurred to me listening all day long. One issue we didn't talk about that much, but was referenced a few times, is the impact of debt on new graduates. I think that makes these issues all the more crucial to many people. The fact is they're not just looking for a job, they're starting in a negative situation, and that makes this so important. I was really struck by the comments about how these issues play out differently for those who have had different life advantages and disadvantages. And I think the challenge actually coming out of this, there was a lot of agreement, like Carol said. Nobody challenged a lot of the assumptions, and yet on the practical carry it out level, I'm not sure if there is as much alignment as perhaps some would like. So I think that's a challenge. Then just very briefly would invite you after to check out the visual notes, check out the EduPulse, and please continue to contribute to the EduPulse hashtag. And most important, go have a great lunch in the foyer. Thank you, everybody.